The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann Rudolf Wyss. Chapter 4. Return from the Journey of Discovery, a Nocturnal Alarm. My poor boy now began to complain of fatigue. The sugar canes galled his shoulders, and he was obliged to shift them often. At last he stopped to take breath. "No," cried he, "I never could have thought that a few sugar canes could be so heavy. How sincerely I pity the poor natives who carry heavy loads of them. Yet how glad I shall be when Mother and Ernest are tasting them." We reached the place where we had left our gourd utensils upon the sands. We found them as hard as bones and not the least misshapen. We now, therefore, could put them into our game bags, conveniently enough, and this done, we continued our way. Scarcely had we passed through the little wood in which we had breakfast, when Turk sprang away to seize upon a troop of monkeys, who were skipping about and amusing themselves without observing our approach. They were thus taken by surprise, and before we could get to the spot, our ferocious Turk had already seized one of them. It was a female who held a young one in her arms, which she was caressing almost to suffocation, and which encumbrance deprived her of the power of escaping. The poor creature was killed and afterwards devoured. The young one hid himself in the grass and looked on, grinding his teeth all the time that this horrid feat was performing. Fritz flew like lightning to make Turk let go of his hold. He lost his hat, threw down his tin bottle, canes, etc., but all in vain. He was too late to prevent the murder of the mother. The next scene that presented itself was of a different nature, and comical enough. The young monkey sprang nimbly on Fritz's shoulders, and fastened his feet in the stiff curls of his hair. Nor could the squalls of Fritz, nor all the shaking he gave him, made him let go of his hold. I ran to them, laughing heartily, for I saw that the animal was too young to do him an injury, while the panic visible in the features of the boy made a ludicrous contrast with the grimaces of the monkey, whom I in vain endeavoured to disengage. "There is no remedy, Fritz," said I, "but to submit quietly and carry him. He will furnish an addition to our stock of provisions, though less alluring, I must needs confess, than for your mother's sake we could wish." The conduct of the little creature displays a surprising intelligence. He has lost his mother, and he adopts you for his father. Perhaps he discovered in you something of the air of a father of a family. Or rather, the little rogue found out that he had to do with a chicken heart, who shrinks from the idea of ill-treating an animal which has thrown itself on his protection. But I assure you, father, he is giving me some terrible twitches, and I shall be obliged to you to try once more to get him off. With a little gentleness and management I succeeded. I took the creature in my arms as one would an infant, nor could I help pitying him and caressing him. He was no larger than a kitten, and quite unable to help himself. Its mother was at least as tall as Fritz. "Father," cried Fritz, "do let me have this little animal to myself. I will take the greatest care of him. I will give him all my share of the milk of the coconuts till we get our cows and goats. And who knows, his monkey instinct may one day assist us in discovering some wholesome fruits." We now thought of resuming our journey. The little orphan jumped again on the shoulder of his protector, while I, on my part, relieved my boy of the bundle of canes. Scarcely had we proceeded a quarter of a league when Turk overtook us in a gallop. Fritz and I received him without the usual marks of kindness, and reproached him with the cruel action he had committed, as if he could feel and understand us. But he showed no sign of concern about the matter. following behind Fritz with an air of cool and perfect satisfaction. The young monkey appeared uneasy from seeing him so near, and passed round and fixed himself on his protector's bosom, who did not long bear so great an inconvenience without having recourse to his invention for a remedy. He tied some string round Turk's body in such a way as to admit of the monkey's being fastened on his back with it, and then in a tone of genuine pity he said, "Now, Mr. Turk, since you had the cruelty to destroy the mother, it is for you to take care of her child." At first the dog was restive and resisted, but by degrees, partly by menaces and partly by caresses, we succeeded in gaining his goodwill, and quietly he consented to carry the little burden. And the young monkey, who also had made some difficulties at length, found himself perfectly accommodated. Fritz put another string around Turk's neck, by which he might lead him, a precaution he used to prevent him from going out of sight. I must confess we had not the sin of too great haste to answer for, so that I had leisure for amusing myself with the idea that we should arrive home with something of the appearance of keepers of rare animals for show. I enjoyed in foresight the jubilations of our young ones when they should see the figure we made. We soon found ourselves on the banks of the river and near our family before we were aware. Flora from the other side announced our approach by a violent barking, and Turk replied so heartily that his motions unseated his little burden, who in his fright jumped the length of his string from his back to Fritz's shoulder, which he could not afterwards be prevailed upon to leave. Turk, who began to be acquainted with the country, ran off to meet his companion, and shortly after our much-loved family appeared in sight, with demonstrations of unbounded joy at our safe return. They advanced along by the course of the river, till they on one side and we on the other had reached the place we crossed in the morning. We repassed it again in safety, and threw ourselves into each other's arms. Scarcely had the young ones joined their brother than they began their joyful exclamations. "A monkey! A live monkey! Papa, Mama, a live monkey! Oh, how delightful! How happy shall we be! How did you catch him? What a droll face he has!" "He is very ugly," said little Frances, half afraid to touch him. "He is much prettier than you," returned Jack. "Only see, he is laughing. I wish I could see him eat." "Ah, if we had but some coconuts," cried Ernest. "Could you not find any? Are they nice? Have you brought me any milk of almonds?" asked Frances. "Have you met with any unfortunate adventure?" interrupted my wife. In this manner questions and exclamations succeeded to each other with such rapidity as not to leave us time to answer them. At length, when all became a little tranquil, I answered them thus: "Most happy am I to return to you again, my beloved, and God be praised, without any new misfortune. We have even the pleasure of presenting you with many valuable acquisitions. But in the object nearest my heart, the discovery of our ship's companions, we have entirely failed." Jack received my gun, Ernest the coconuts, Frances the gourd rinds, and my wife my game bag. Fritz distributed the sugar canes, and put his monkey on the back of Turk, to the great amusement of the children, at the same time begging Ernest to relieve him of his gun. But Ernest, ever careful of his ease, assured him that the large heavy bowls with which he was loaded were the most he had strength to carry. His mother, a little too indulgent to his lazy humour, relieved him of these, and thus we proceeded all together to our tent. Fritz whispered to me that if Ernest had known what the large heavy bowls were, he would not so readily have parted with them. Then turning to his brother, "Why, Ernest," cried he, "do you know that those bowls are coconuts, your dear coconuts, and full of the sweet, nice milk you have so much wished to taste." "What? Really and truly coconuts? Pray give them to me, mother. I will carry them, if you please, and I can carry the gun too." "No, no, Ernest," answered his mother. "You shall not tease us with more of your long-drawn sighs about fatigue. 100 paces and you would begin again." Ernest would willingly have asked his mother to give him the coconuts and take the gun herself, but this he was ashamed to do. "I have only," said he, "to get rid of these sticks and carry the gun in my hand." "I would advise you not to find the sticks heavy either," said Fritz dryly. "I know you will be sorry if you do, and for this good reason. The sticks are sugar canes." "Sugar canes, sugar canes," exclaimed all, and surrounding Fritz, made him give them full instructions on the sublime art of sucking sugar canes. My wife also, who had always entertained a high respect for the article of sugar in her household management, was quite astonished, and asked us to inform her of all particulars. I gave her an account of our journey and our new acquisitions, which I exhibited one after the other for her inspection. No one of them afforded her more pleasure than the plates and dishes, because to persons of decent habits they were articles of indispensable necessity. We now adjourned to our kitchen, and observed with pleasure the preparations for an excellent repast. On one side of the fire was a turnspit, which my wife had contrived by driving 2 forked pieces of wood in the ground and placing a long even stick, sharpened at one end, across them. By this invention she was enabled to roast fish or other food with the help of little Francis, who was entrusted with the care of turning it round from time to time. On the occasion of our return, she had prepared us the treat of a goose, the fat of which ran off into some oyster shells, placed there to serve the purpose of a dripping pan. There was besides a dish of fish, which the little ones had caught, and the iron pot was upon the fire, provided with a good soup, the odour of which increased our appetite. By the side of these most exhilarating preparations stood one of the casks which we had recovered from the sea, the head of which my wife had knocked out, so that it exposed to our view a cargo of the finest Dutch cheeses, contained in round tins. All this display was made to excite the appetite of 2 travellers, who had fared but scantily during the day, and I must observe that the whole was very little like the dinner one would expect to see on a desert island. "What you call a goose," said my wife, "is a kind of wild bird, and is the booty of Ernest, who calls it by a singular name, and assures me that it is good to eat." "Yes, father, I believe that the bird which I have caught is a kind of penguin." "Ernest killed the bird," interrupted his mother, "and was able to tell his kind, 'We on our parts shall eat him. What more therefore is necessary?' Do you not see, husband, that the poor child is thinking all the while of his coconuts? Let me intercede on his behalf, and prevail you to let him have the pleasure of examining and tasting them. Come then, the supper is ready, and the coconuts shall be for the dessert." We seated ourselves on the ground. My wife had placed each article of the repast in one of our new dishes, the neat appearance of which exceeded all our expectations. My sons had not the patience to wait, but had broken the coconuts, and already convinced themselves of their delicious flavour, and then they fell to making spoons with the fragments of the shells. The little monkey, thanks to the kind temper of Jack, had been served the first, and each amused himself with making him suck the corner of his pocket handkerchief dipped in the milk of the coconut. He appeared delighted with the treatment he received, and we remarked with satisfaction that we should most likely be able to preserve him. The boys were preparing to break some more of the nuts with the hatchet after having drawn out the milk through the 3 little holes, when I pronounced the word halt and bade them bring me a saw. The thought had struck me that by dividing the nuts carefully with this instrument, the 2 halves, when scooped, would remain with the form of teacups or basins already made to our hands. Jack, who was on every occasion the most active, brought me the saw. I performed my undertaking in the best manner I could, and in a short time each of us was provided with a convenient dish for food. My wife put the share of soup which belonged to each into the new basins. She appeared delighted that we should no longer be under the necessity, as before, of scalding our fingers by dipping into the pot. And I firmly believe that never did the most magnificent service of china occasion half the pleasure to its possessor, that our utensils, manufactured by our own hands from gourds and coconuts, excited in the kind heart of my wife. Fritz asked me if he might not invite our company to taste his fine champagne, which he said would not fail to make us all the merrier. I have not the least objection, answered I, but remember to taste it yourself before you serve it to your guests. He ran to draw out the stopper and to taste it. How unfortunate, said he, it is already turned to vinegar. What, is it vinegar? Exclaimed my wife. How lucky! It will make the most delicious sauce for our bird, mixed with a fat which has fallen from it in roasting, and will be as good a relish as a salad. This vinegar produced from coconut proved a corrective of the wild and fishy flavour of the penguin. The same sauce improved our dish of fish also. By the time we finished our meal, the sun was retiring from our view, and recollecting how quickly the night would fall upon us, we were in great haste to regain our place of rest. My wife had considerately collected a 10-fold quantity of dry grass, which she had spread in the tent, so that we anticipated with joy the prospect of stretching our limbs on a substance somewhat approaching the quality of mattresses, while the night before our bodies seemed to touch the ground. Our flock of fowls placed themselves as they had done the preceding evening. We said our prayers, and with calmness lay down in the tent, taking with us the young monkey, who had become the little favourite of all. Fritz and Jack contended for a short time which should enjoy the honour of his company for the night, and it was at last decided that he should be laid between them, after which each would have a hand in covering him carefully, that he might not catch cold. We now all lay down upon the grass in the order of the night before, myself remaining last, to fasten the sailcloth in front of the tent. When heartily fatigued by the exertions of the day, I, as well as the rest, soon fell into a profound and refreshing sleep. But I had not long enjoyed this, when I was wakened by the fowls on the ridge of the tent, and by a violent barking of our vigilant safeguards, the dogs. I was instantly on my legs. My wife and Fritz, who had also been alarmed, got up too, and we each took a gun and sallied forth. The dogs continued barking with the same violence, and at intervals even howled. We had not proceeded many steps from the tent, when to our surprise we perceived by the light of the moon a terrible combat. At least a dozen jackals had surrounded our brave dogs, who defended themselves with the stoutest courage. Already the fierce champions had laid 3 or 4 of the adversaries on the ground, while those that remained began a timid kind of moan, as if imploring pity and forbearance. Meanwhile, they did not the less endeavour to surprise the dogs, thus thrown off their guard, and thus secure to themselves the advantage. But our watchful combatants were not so easily deceived. They took good care not to let the enemy approach them too nearly. I, for my part, had feared something worse than jackals. "We shall soon manage to set these gentlemen at rest," said I. "Let us both fire together, my boy, but let us take care how we aim, for fear of killing the dogs. Mind how you fire, that you may not miss, and I shall do the same." We fired, and 2 of the intruders fell instantly dead upon the sands. The others made their escape, but we perceived it was with difficulty, in consequence, no doubt, of being wounded. Turk and Flora afterwards pursued them, and put the finishing stroke to what we had begun, and thus the battle ended. But the dogs, true Caribbees by nature, made a hearty meal on the flesh of their fallen enemies. My wife, seeing all quiet, entreated us to lie down again and finish our night's sleep. But Fritz asked me to let him drag the jackal towards the tent, that he might exhibit him the next morning to his brothers. I, however, observed to Fritz that if Turk and Flora were still hungry, we ought to give them this last jackal in addition as a recompense for their courageous behaviour. We had done now with this affair. The body of the jackal was left on the rock by the side of the tent, in which were the little sleepers, who had not once wakened during the whole of the scene which had been passing. Having therefore nothing further to prevent us, we lay down by their side till day began to break, and till the cocks with their shrill morning salutations awoke us both. The children, being still asleep, afforded us an excellent opportunity to consult together respecting the plan we should pursue for the ensuing day. Chapter 5. Return to the wreck. I broke a silence of some moments by observing to my wife that I could not but view with alarm the many cares and exertions to be made. In the first place, I said, a journey to the vessel. This is of absolute necessity, at least if we would not be deprived of the cattle and other useful things which from moment to moment we risk losing by the first heavy sea. What ought we to resolve upon? For example, would not our first endeavour be the contriving of a better sort of habitation, and a more secure retreat from the wild beasts? Also a separate place for our provisions. I own I am at a loss what to begin first. All will fall into the right order by degrees, observed my wife. Patience and regularity in our plans will go as far as actual labour. I cannot, I confess, help shuddering at the thought of this voyage to the vessel. But if you judge it to be of absolute necessity, it cannot be undertaken too soon. In the meanwhile, nothing that is immediately under my own care shall stand still, I promise you. Let us not be over anxious about tomorrow. Sufficient until the day is the evil thereof. These were the words of the true friend of mankind, and let us use so wise a counsel for our own benefit. I will follow your advice, said I, and without further loss of time, you shall stay here with the 3 youngest boys, and Fritz, being so much stronger and more intelligent than the others, shall accompany me in the undertaking. At this moment I started from my bed, crying out loudly and briskly, "Get up, children, get up. It is almost light, and we have some important projects for today. It would be a shame to suffer the sun to find us still sleeping. We who are to be founders of a new colony." At these words, Fritz sprang nimbly out of the tent, while the young ones began to gape and rub their eyes to get rid of their sleepiness. Fritz ran to visit his jackal, which during the night had become cold and perfectly still. He fixed him upon his legs and placed him like a sentinel at the entrance of the tent, joyously anticipating the wonder and exclamations of his brothers at so unexpected an appearance. But no sooner than the dogs caught sight of him than they began to howl and set themselves in motion to fall upon him instantly, thinking he was alive. Fritz had enough to do to restrain them, and succeeded only by dint of coaxing and perseverance. In the meantime, their barking had awakened the younger boys, and they ran out of the tent, curious to know what could be the occasion. Jack was the first who appeared, with the young monkey on his shoulders. But when the little creature perceived the jackal, he sprang away in terror and hid himself at the furthest extremity of the grass which composed our bed, and covered himself so completely that scarcely could the tip of his nose be seen. The children were much surprised at the sight of a yellow-coloured animal standing motionless at the entrance of the tent. "Oh heavens!" exclaimed Francis, and stepping back a few paces for fear. "It is a wolf." "No, no," said Jack, going near the jackal and taking one of his paws. "It is a yellow dog, and he is dead. He does not move at all." "It is neither a dog nor a wolf," interrupted Ernest in a consequential tone. "Do you not see that it is a golden fox?" "Best of all, most learned professor," now exclaimed Fritz. "So you can tell an agouti when you see him, but you cannot tell a jackal. For a jackal is the creature you see before you, and I killed him myself in the night." The next thing thought of was breakfast, for the appetites of all young boys open with their eyes. Today their mother had nothing to give them for their morning meal but some biscuit, which was so hard and dry that it was with difficulty we could swallow it. Fritz asked for a piece of cheese to eat with it, and Ernest cast some searching looks on the second cask we had drawn out of the sea, to discover whether it also contained Dutch cheeses. In a minute he came up to us, joy sparkling in his eyes. "Father," said he, "if we had but a little butter spread upon our biscuit, do you think it would improve it?" "That indeed it would. But if, these never-ending ifs are but a poor dependence. For my part, I had rather eat a bit of cheese with my biscuit at once than think of ifs that bring us so meagre a harvest." Ernest replied, "Perhaps, though, the ifs may be found to be worth something if we were to knock out the head of this cask." "What cask, my boy, and what are you talking about?" Ernest replied, "I am talking of this cask, which is filled with excellent salt butter. I made a little opening in it with a knife, and see, I got out enough to spread nicely upon this piece of biscuit." "That glutton instinct of yours for once is of some general use," answered I. "But now let us profit by the event. Who will have some butter on his biscuit?" The boys surrounded the cask in a moment, while I was in some perplexity as to the best method of getting at the contents. Fritz was for taking off the topmost hoop, and thus loosening one of the ends, but this I objected to, observing that the great heat of the sun would not fail to melt the butter, which would then run out and be wasted. The idea occurred to me that I would make a hole in the bottom of the cask, sufficiently large to take out a small quantity of butter at a time, and I set about manufacturing a little wooden shovel to use for the purpose. All this succeeded vastly well, and we sat down to breakfast, some biscuits and a coconut shell full of salt butter being placed on the ground, round which we all assembled. We toasted our biscuit, and while it was hot applied the butter, and contrived to make a hearty breakfast. "One of the things we must not forget to look for in the vessel," said Fritz, "is a spiked collar or two for our dogs, as a protection to them should they again be called upon to defend themselves from wild beasts, which I fear will too probably be the case." "Oh," says Jack, "I can make spiked collars if my mother will give me a little help." "That I will, most readily, my boy, for I should like to see what new fancy has come into your head." "Yes, yes," pursed I, "as many new inventions as you please. You cannot better employ your time. And if you produce something useful, you will be rewarded with the commendations of all. But now for work. You, Mr. Fritz, who from your superior age and discretion enjoy the high honour of being my privy counsellor, must make haste and get yourself ready, and we will undertake today our voyage to the vessel, to bring away whatever may be possible. You younger boys will remain here under the wing of your mother." While Fritz was getting the boat ready, I looked about for a pole and tied a piece of white linen to the end of it. This I drove into the ground, in a place where it would be visible from the vessel, and I concerted with my wife that in case of any accident that might require my prompt assistance, they should take down the pole and fire a gun 3 times as a signal of distress, and I would immediately turn back. But I gave her notice that there being so many things to accomplish on board the vessel, it was probable that we should not otherwise return at night, in which case I, on my part, also promised to make signals. My wife had the good sense and courage to consent to my plan. She, however, extorted from me a promise that we should pass the night in our tubs, and not on board the ship. We took nothing with us but our guns and a supply of powder and shot, relying that we should find provisions on board. Yet I did not refuse to indulge Fritz in the wish he expressed, to take the young monkey as he wished to see how the little creature would like some milk from the cow or from a goat. We embarked in silence, casting our anxious looks on the beloved objects we were quitting. Fritz rowed steadily, and I did my best to second his endeavours, by rowing from time to time on my part, with the oar which served me for a rudder. When we had gone some distance, I remarked a current which was visible a long way. To take advantage of this current, and to husband our strength by means of it, was my first care. Little as I knew of the management of sea affairs, I succeeded in keeping our boat in the direction in which it ran, by which means we were drawn gently until, at length, the gradual diminution of its force obliged us again to have recourse to our oars. But our arms having now rested for some time, we were ready for new exertions. A little afterwards we found ourselves safely arrived at the cleft of the vessel, and fastened our boat securely to one of its timbers. Fritz went with his young monkey on his arm to the main deck, where he found all the animals we had left on board assembled. I followed him, well pleased to observe the generous impatience he showed to relieve the wants of the poor abandoned creatures, who one and all now saluted us by the sounds natural to their species. It was not so much the want of food as the desire of seeing their accustomed human companions, which made them manifest their joy in this manner, for they had a portion of the food and water we had left them still remaining. We next examined the food and water of the other animals, taking away what was half spoiled and adding a fresh supply that no anxiety on their account might interrupt our enterprise. Nor did we neglect the care of renewing our own strength by a plentiful repast. While we were seated and appeasing the calls of hunger, Fritz and I consulted what should be our first occupation, when to my surprise, the advice he gave was that we should contrive a sail for our small boat. "In the name of heaven," cried I, "what makes you think of this at so critical a moment? when we have so many things of indispensable necessity to arrange?" "True, father," said Fritz, "but let me confess that I found it very difficult to row for so long a time. Though I assure you I did my best, and did not spare my strength, I observed that though the wind blew strong in my face, the current still carried us on. Now, as the current will be of no use on our way back, I was thinking that we might make the wind supply its place. Our boat will be very heavy when we have loaded it with the things we mean to take away, and I am afraid I shall not be strong enough to row to land. So do you not think that a sail would be a good thing just now?" "Ah, Mr. Fritz, you wish to spare yourself a little trouble, do you? Seriously, I perceive much good sense in your argument, and feel obliged to my privy counsellor for his good advice. The best thing we can do is to take care not to overload the boat, and thus avoid the danger of sinking or of being obliged to throw some of our stores overboard. We will, however, set to work upon your sail. It will give us a little trouble, but come, let us begin." I assisted Fritz to carry a pole strong enough for a mast, and another not so thick for a sail yard. I directed him to make a hole in a plank with a chisel, large enough for the mast to stand upright in it. I then went to the sail room and cut a large sail down to a triangular shape. I made holes along the edges and passed cords through them. We then got a pulley, and with this and some cords and some contrivance in the management of our materials, we produced a sail. Fritz, after taking observations through a telescope of what was passing on land, and which we had already done several times, imparted the agreeable tidings that all was well with our dear family. He had distinguished his mother walking tranquilly along the shore. He soon after brought me a small streamer, which he had cut from a piece of linen, and which he entreated me to tie to the extremity of the mast. As much delighted with the streamer as with the sail itself, he gave to our machine the name the Deliverance, and in speaking of it, instead of calling it a boat, it had now the title of the Little Vessel. "But now, father," said Fritz, looking kindly on me as he spoke, "as you have eased me of the labour of rowing, it is my turn to take care of you. I am thinking to make you a better contrived rudder, one that would enable you to steer the boat both with greater ease and greater safety." "Your thought would be a very good one," said I, "but that I am unwilling to lose the advantage of being able to proceed this way and that, without being obliged to veer. I shall therefore fix our oars in such a manner as to enable me to steer the raft from either end." Accordingly, I fixed bits of wood to the stem and stern of the machine, in the nature of grooves which were calculated to spare us a great deal of trouble. During these exertions the day advanced, and I saw that we should be obliged to pass the night in our tubs, without much progress in our task of emptying the vessel. We had promised our family to hoist a flag as a signal if we passed the night from home, and we found the streamer precisely the thing we wanted for this purpose. We employed the remainder of the day in emptying the tubs of the useless ballast of stones, and putting in their place what would be of service, such as nails, pieces of cloth, and different kinds of utensils, etc., etc. The vandals themselves could not have made a more complete pillage than we did. The prospect before us of entire solitude made us devote our attention to the securing of as much powder and shot as we could, as a means of catching animals for food and of defending ourselves against wild beasts to the latest moment possible. Utensils for every kind of workmanship, of which there was a large provision in the ship, were also objects of incalculable value to us. The vessel, which was now a wreck, had been sent out as a preparation for the establishment of a colony in the South Seas, and had been provided with a variety of stores not commonly included in the loading of a ship. Among the rest, care had been taken to have on board considerable numbers of European cattle, but not so long a voyage had proved unfavourable to the oxen and horses, the greatest part of which had died, and the others were in so bad a condition that it had been found necessary to destroy them. The quantity of useful things which presented themselves in the store chambers made it difficult for me to select among them, and I much regretted that circumstances compelled me to leave some of them behind. Fritz, however, already meditated a second visit, but we took good care not to lose the present occasion for securing knives and forks and spoons, and a complete assortment of kitchen utensils. In the captain's cabin we found some services of silver, dishes and plates of high-wrought metal, and a little chest filled with many bottles of excellent wine. Each of these we put into our boat. We next descended to the kitchen, which we stripped of gridirons, kettles, pots of all kinds, a small roasting jack, etc. Our last prize was a chest of choice stables, intended for the table of the officers, containing Westphalia hams, Bologna sausages, and other savoury food. I took good care not to forget some sacks of maize, of wheat and other grain, and some potatoes. We next added such implements for husbandry as we could: shovels, hoes, spades, rakes, harrows. Fritz reminded me that we had found sleeping on the ground both cold and hard, and prevailed upon me to increase our cargo by some hammocks and a certain number of blankets. And, as guns had hitherto been the source of his pleasures, he added such as he could find of a peculiar costliness or structure, together with some sabres and clasp knives. The last articles we took were a barrel of sulphur, a quantity of ropes, some small string, and a large roll of sailcloth. The vessel appeared to us to be so wretched a condition that the least tempest must make her go to pieces. It was then quite uncertain whether we should be able to approach her any more. Our cargo was so large that the tubs were filled to the very brim, and no inch of the boat's room was lost. The first and the last of the tubs were reserved for Fritz and me to seat ourselves in and row the boat, which sank so low in the water that if the sea had not been quite calm, we should have been obliged to ease her of some of the loading. We, however, used the precaution of putting on our swimming jackets, for fear of any misfortune. It will easily be imagined that the day had been laboriously employed. Night suddenly surprised us, and we lost all hope of returning to our family the same evening. A large blazing fire on the shore soon after greeted our sight, the signal agreed upon for assuring us that all was well, and to bid us close our eyes in peace. We returned the compliment by tying 4 lanterns with lights in them to our masthead. This was answered on their part by the firing of 2 guns, so that both parties had reason to be satisfied and easy. After offering up our earnest prayers for the safety of all, and not without some apprehension for our own, we resigned ourselves to sleep in our tubs, which appeared to us to be safer than the vessel. Our night passed tranquilly enough. My boy Fritz slept as if he had been in bed, while I, haunted by the recollection of the nocturnal visit of the jackals, could neither close my eyes nor keep them from the direction of the tent. I had, however, great reliance that my valiant dogs would do their duty, and was thankful to heaven for having enabled us to preserve so good a protection. Chapter 6. A troop of animals in cork jackets. Early the next morning, though scarcely light, I mounted the vessel, hoping to gain a sight of our beloved companions through a telescope. Fritz prepared a breakfast of biscuit and ham. But before we sat down, we recollected that in the captain's cabin we had seen a telescope of much superior size and power, and we speedily conveyed it to the deck. While this was being done, the brightness of the day had come on. I fixed my eye to the glass and discovered my wife was coming out of the tent and looking attentively towards the vessel, and at the same moment perceived the motion of the flag upon the shore. A load of anxiety was thus taken from my heart, for I had the certainty that all were in good health and had escaped the dangers of the night. "Now that I have had a sight of your mother," said I to Fritz, "my next concern is for the animals on board. Let us endeavour to save the lives of some of them and to take them with us." "Would it be possible to make a raft to get them all upon it and in this way get them to the shore?" asked Fritz. "But what difficulty in making it, and how could we induce a cow, an ass and a sow either to get upon a raft or when there to remain motionless and quiet? The sheep and goats one might perhaps find means to remove, they being of a more docile temper, but for the larger animals I am at a loss how to proceed." "My advice, father, is to tie a long rope round the sow's neck and throw her without ceremony into the sea. Her immense weight will be sure to sustain her above water, and we can draw her after the boat. Your idea is excellent, but unfortunately it is of no use but for the pig, and she is the one I care the least about preserving." "Then there is another idea, father. Let us tie a swimming jacket round the body of each animal and contrive to throw one and all into the water. You will see that they will swim like fish, and we can draw them after us in the same manner." "Right, very right, my boy. Your idea is admirable. Let us therefore not lose a moment in making the experiment." We hastened to the execution of our design. We fixed a jacket on one of the lambs and threw it into the sea, and full of anxious curiosity, I followed the poor beast with my eyes. He sank at first, and I thought him drowned, but he soon reappeared, shaking the water from his head, and in a few seconds he had learned completely the art of swimming. After another interval, we observed that he appeared fatigued, gave up his efforts, and suffered himself to be borne along by the course of the water, which sustained and conducted him to our complete satisfaction. "Victory!" exclaimed I. "These useful animals are all our own. Let us not lose a moment in adopting the same means with those that remain, but take care not to lose our little lamb." Fritz now would have jumped into the water to follow the poor creature, who was still floating safely on the surface, but I stopped him till I had seen him tie on a swimming jacket. He took with him a rope, first making a slip knot in it, and soon overtaking the lamb, threw it round his neck and drew him back to our boat, and then took him out of the water. We next got 4 small water butts. I emptied them and then carefully closed them again. I united them with a large piece of sailcloth, nailing one end to each cask. I strengthened this with a second piece of sailcloth, and this contrivance I destined to support the cow and the ass, 2 casks to each, the animal being placed in the middle with a cask on each side. I added a thong of leather stretching from the casks across the breast and haunches of the animal to make the whole secure, and thus, in less than an hour, both my cow and my ass were equipped for swimming. It was next the turn of the smaller animals. Of these, the sow gave us the most trouble. We were first obliged to put a muzzle on her to prevent her biting, and then we tied a large piece of cork under her body. The sheep and goats were more accommodating, and we had soon accoutred them for our adventure. And now we had succeeded in assembling them all on deck in readiness for the voyage. We tied a cord to either the horns or the neck of each animal, and to the other end of the cord a piece of wood similar to the mode used for marking nets, that it might be easy for us to take hold of the ropes, and so draw the animals to us if it should be necessary. We struck away some more of the shattered pieces of wood from the fissure of the vessel by which we were again to pass. We began our experiment with the ass by conducting him as near as possible to the brink of the vessel, and then suddenly shoving him off. He fell into the water and for a moment disappeared, but we soon saw him rise, and in the action of swimming between his two barrels with a grace which really merited our commendation. Next came the cow's turn, and as she was infinitely more valuable than the ass, my fears increased in due proportion. The ass had swum so courageously that he was already at a considerable distance from the vessel, so that there was sufficient room for our experiment on the cow. We had more difficulty in pushing her overboard, but she reached the water in as much safety as the ass had done before. She did not sink so low in it, and was no less perfectly sustained by the empty barrels, and she made her way with gravity, and if I may so express it, with a sort of dignified composure. According to this method, we proceeded with our whole troop, throwing them one by one into the water, where by and by they appeared in a group, floating at their ease and seemingly well content. The sow was the only exception. She became quite furious, set up a loud squalling, and struggled with so much violence in the water that she was carried to a considerable distance, but fortunately in a direction towards the landing place we had in view. We had now not a moment to lose. Our last act was to put on our cork jackets, and then we descended without accident through the cleft, took our station in the boat, and we were soon in the midst of our troop of quadrupeds. We carefully gathered all the floating bits of wood and fastened them to the stern of the machine and drew them after us. When everything was adjusted and our company in order, we hoisted our sail, which soon filling with a favourable wind, conducted us all safe to the land. We now perceived how impossible it would have been for us to have succeeded in our enterprise without the aid of a sail, for the weight of so many animals sank the boat so low in the water that all our exertions to row to such a distance would have been ineffectual, while by means of the sail she proceeded completely to our satisfaction, bearing in her train our company of animals. Nor could we help laughing heartily at the singular appearance we made. Proud of the success of so extraordinary a feat, we were in high spirits, and seated ourselves in the tubs, where we made an excellent dinner. Fritz amused himself with the monkey, while I was occupied in thinking of those I had left on land, and of whom I now tried to take a view through my telescope. My last act on board the vessel had been to take one look more at those beloved beings, and I perceived my wife and the 3 boys all in motion, and seeming to be setting out on some excursion. But it was in vain that I endeavoured by anything I saw to conjecture what their plan might be. I therefore seized the first moment of quiet to make another trial with my glass, when a sudden exclamation from Fritz filled me with alarm. "Oh heavens," cried he, "we are lost. A fish of an enormous size is coming up to the boat." "And why lost?" said I, half angry, and yet half partaking of his fright. "Be ready with your gun, and the moment he is close upon us, we will fire upon him." He had nearly reached the boat, and with the rapidity of lightning had seized the foremost sheep. At this instant Fritz aimed his fire so skillfully that the balls of the gun were lodged in the head of the monster, which was an enormous shark. The fish half turned himself round in the water and hurried off to sea, leaving us to observe the lustrous roundness of his body, and that as he proceeded he stained the water red, which convinced us he had been severely wounded. I determined to have the best of our guns at hand the rest of the way, lest we should be again attacked by the same fish or another of his species. The animal being now out of sight and our fears appeased, I resumed the rudder, and as the wind drove us straight towards the bay, I took down the sail and continued rowing till we reached a convenient spot for our cattle to land. I had them only to untie the end of the cords from the boat, and they stepped contentedly on shore. Our voyage thus happily concluded. We followed their example. I had already been surprised and uneasy at finding none of my family looking out for us on the shore. We could not, however, set out in search of them till we had disencumbered our animals of their swimming apparatus. Scarcely had we entered upon this employment when I relieved by the joyful sounds which reached our ears and filled our hearts with rapture. It was my wife and the youngest boys who uttered them, the latter of whom were soon close up to us, and their mother followed not many steps behind. Each and all of them in excellent health and eager for our salutations. When the first burst of happiness at meeting had subsided, we all sat down on the grass, and I began to give them an account of our occupations in the vessel and of all our different plans and their success in the order in which they occurred. My wife could find no words to express her surprise and joy at seeing so many useful animals round us, and the hearty affection she expressed for them in language the most simple and touching increased my satisfaction at the completion of our enterprise. "Yes," said Fritz, "for this once the Privy Councillor has tried his talents at invention." "This indeed is very true," replied I. "In all humility have I to confess that to Fritz alone all praise belongs, and that to his sagacity it is that we are indebted for our success." His mother could not refrain from giving him a hearty kiss. "Our gratitude is due to both," said she, "for both have laboured to give us the possession of this troop of animals, an acquisition beyond any other, agreeable and serviceable to us in the situation in which it has pleased Providence to place us." Ernest and Jack now ran to the boat and began to shout their admiration of the mast, the sail and the flag, desiring their brother to explain to them how all the things they saw had been effected and what he himself had done. In the meantime, we began to unpack our cargo, while Jack stole aside and amused himself with the animals, took off the jackets from the sheep and goats, bursting from time to time into shouts of laughter at the ridiculous figure of the ass, who stood before them adorned with 2 casks and his swimming apparatus, and braying loud enough to make us deaf. By and by I perceived with surprise that Jack had round his waist a belt of metal covered with yellow skin, in which were fixed 2 pistols. "In the name of heaven," exclaimed I, "where did you procure this curious costume which gives you the look of a smuggler?" "From my own manufactory," replied he, "and if you cast your eyes upon the dogs, you will see more of my specimens." Accordingly, I looked at them and perceived that each had on a collar similar to the belt round Jack's waist, with however the exception of the collars being armed with nails, the points of which were outwards and exhibited a formidable appearance. "And is it you, Mr. Jack," cried I, "who have invented and executed these collars and your belt?" "Yes, father, they are indeed my invention, with a little of my mother's assistance when it was necessary to use the needle." "But where did you get the leather, the thread and the needle?" "Fritz Jackal furnished the first," answered my wife, "and as to the last, her good mother of a family is always provided with them. Then have I not an enchanted bag from which I draw out such articles as I stand in need of? So if you have a particular fancy for anything, you have only to acquaint me with it." I tenderly embraced her to express my thanks for this effort to amuse by such agreeable raillery. And Jack too came in for his share of the caresses and our hearty commendations. But Fritz was both discontented and angry on finding that Jack had taken upon him to dispose of his jackal and to cut his beautiful skin into strips. He, however, concealed his ill humour as well as he could, but presently he called out suddenly, holding his nose as he spoke, "What a filthy smell! Does it proceed from you, Mr. Courier? Is this the perfume we may expect from your manufactory?" "It is rather yours than mine," replied Jack in a resentful tone, "for it was your jackal which you hung up in the sun to dry, and which would have been dried in a whole skin if it had not pleased your sublime fancy to cut it to pieces, instead of leaving me the power to do what I please with my own booty," answered his brother. "Fritz," said I, in a somewhat angry tone, "this is not generous on your part. Of what importance is it who cut up the skin of the jackal, if by so doing it has contributed to our use? What is discovered or produced by one of you should be equally for the service of all without distinction. It is quite certain, Jack, that the belt round your waist, not being dry, has no offensive smell. The pleasure of wearing what you had ingeniously contrived makes you willing to bear the inconvenience, but we should never make our own pleasure the pain of another. I therefore desire that you will take it off and place it in the sun to dry, and take care that it does not shrink during the operation, and then you can join your brothers and assist them to throw the jackal into the sea." Fritz's ill humour was already over, but Jack, whose temper was less docile, still retained the belt, and walked about in it with somewhat of an air of resistance. His brothers continued their warfare, pretending to avoid him, and crying out, "What a smell! What a smell!" till at length Jack, tired with the part he had been acting, suddenly stripped off the belt and joined the others in dragging the dead jackal to the sea, where he no longer offended anyone. Chapter 7. Construction of a Bridge. When my wife and I awoke the next morning, we resumed the question of our change of abode. I observed to her that it was a matter of difficulty, and that we might have reason to repent such a step. "My own opinion is," said I, "that we had better remain here, where Providence seems to have conducted us. The place is favourable to our personal safety, and is near the vessel from which we may continue to enrich ourselves. We are on all sides protected by the rocks. it is an asylum inaccessible except by the sea, or by the passage of the river, which is not easily accomplished. Let us then have patience, yet a little longer at least, till we have got all that can be removed, or that would be useful to us from the ship." My wife replied that the intense heat of the sands was insupportable, that by remaining we lost all hope of procuring fruits of any kind, and must live on oysters or on such wild birds as the one we found so unpalatable. "As for the safety you boast of," pursued she, "the rocks did not prevent our receiving a visit from the jackals, nor is it improbable that tigers or other animals might follow their example. Lastly, as to the treasures we might continue to draw from the vessel, I renounce them with all my heart. We are already in possession of provisions and other useful things, and to say the truth, my heart is always filled with distressing apprehensions when you and Fritz are exposed to the danger of the sea. We will then think seriously of the matter, but let us have a well-digested scheme of operation before we leave this spot for your favourite wood. First we must contrive a storehouse among the rocks for our provisions and other things, and to which in case of invasion in the wood we can retreat and defend ourselves. This agreed, the next thing is to throw a bridge across the river, if we are to pass it with all our family and baggage." "A bridge?" exclaimed my wife. "Can you possibly think of such a thing? If we stay while you build a bridge, we may consider ourselves fixed for life. Why should we not cross the river as we did before? The ass and the cow will carry all we possess upon their backs. But do you recollect that to keep what they carried dry, they must not perform their journey as they did from the vessel? For this reason, then, if for no other, we must contrive a bridge. We shall want also some sacks and baskets to contain our property. You may therefore set about making these, and I will undertake the bridge, which the more I consider, the more I find to be a necessity, for the stream will, no doubt, at times increase, and the passage become impracticable in any other way. At this moment it would be found so for our short-legged animals, and I am sure you would not wish to see them drowned." "Well, then a bridge let it be," said my wife, "and you will leave our stock of gunpowder here, I hope, for I am never easy with it so near us. A thunderstorm or some thoughtless action of one of the boys might expose us to serious dangers." "You are right, my love, and I will carefully attend to your suggestion. We will keep on hand only a sufficient quantity for daily use. I will contrive a place in the rock for the rest, where it will be safe from the chance of fire or dampness. It is an article which, according to the use which is made of it, may become on the one hand a most dangerous enemy, and on the other a most useful friend." Thus then we decided the important question of removing to a new abode, after which we fixed upon a plan of labour for the day and then awoke the boys. Their delight on hearing of our project may easily be conceived, but they expressed their fear that it would be a long while before a bridge could be built, a single hour appearing an age to them, with such a novelty in view as the prospect of removing to the wood to live under the giant trees. They, in the fullness of their joy, entreated that the place might be called the Promised Land. We now began to look about for breakfast, Fritz taking care not to neglect his monkey. My wife undertook to milk one of the goats and then the cow, and afterwards gave some of the milk to each of the children. With a pair of what remained, she made a sort of soup with biscuits, and the rest she put into one of the flasks to accompany us in our expedition. During this time, I was preparing the boat for another journey to the vessel, to bring away a sufficient quantity of planks and timbers for the bridge. After breakfast we set out, and now I took with me Ernest as well as Fritz, that we might accomplish our object in a shorter time. We rowed stoutly till we had reached the current, which soon drew us on beyond the bay. But scarcely had we passed a little islet lying on one side of us when we perceived an enormous number of seagulls and other birds. I had a curiosity to discover what could be the reason of such an assemblage of these creatures. I steered for the spot, but finding that the boat made but little way, I hoisted my sail. To Ernest our expedition afforded the highest delight. He was in ecstasies at seeing the sail begin to swell, and the motion of the streamer in the air. Fritz on his part did not for a moment take his eyes from the islet where the birds were. Presently he suddenly exclaimed, "I see what it is. The birds are all pecking tooth and beak at a monstrous fish, which lies dead upon the soil." I approached near enough to step upon the land, and after bringing the boat to an anchor with a heavy stone, we stole softly up to the birds. We soon perceived that the object which attracted them was in reality an enormous fish, which had been thrown there by the sea. So eagerly were they occupied with the feast that not one of them attempted to fly off. We observed with astonishment their extreme voracity. Each bird was so intent upon its prey that we might have killed great numbers of them with our sticks alone. Fritz did not cease to express his wonder at the monstrous size of the animal, and asked me by what means he could have got there. "I believe," answered I, "you yourself the means. There is every appearance that it is the very shark you wounded yesterday. See, here are the 2 balls which you discharged at its head." Yes, it is the very same," said my young hero, skipping about for joy. "I will remember I had 2 balls in my gun, and here they are, lodged in his hideous head." "I grant it is hideous enough," continued I. "Its aspect even when dead makes one shudder, particularly when I recollect how easy it would have been for him to have devoured us. See what a huge mouth he has, and what a rough and prickly skin. One might almost use it for a file. And his length must be above 20 feet. We ought to be thankful to Providence, and a little to our Fritz also, for having delivered us from such a monster. But let us take away with us some pieces of his skin, for I have an idea that it may, in some way or other, be useful to us. But how to get at him is the difficulty." Ernest drew out the iron ramrod from his gun, and by striking with it to the right and left among the birds, soon dispersed them. Fritz and I then advanced and cut several long strips of skin from the head of the shark, with which we were proceeding to our boat, when I observed lying on the ground some planks and timbers which had recently been cast by the sea on this little island. On measuring the largest, we perceived they would answer our purpose, and with the assistance of the crowbar and a lever we had brought with us, found means to get them into the boat, and thus spare ourselves the trouble of proceeding to the vessel. With great exertion we contrived to bind the timbers together, with the planks upon them in the manner of a raft, and tied them to the end of the boat, so that through this adventure we were ready to return in 4 hours from the time of departure, and might boast of having done a good day's work. I accordingly pushed again for the current, which soon drove us out to sea. Then I tacked about and resumed the direct route for the bay. All this succeeded to my utmost wishes. I unfurled my sail, and a brisk wind soon conveyed us to our landing place. We once more landed safely on our shore, but no one of our family appeared. we called to them as loud as we could, which was answered by the same sounds in return, and in a few minutes my wife appeared between her two little boys returning from the river, a rising piece of ground having concealed her from our sight. Each carried a handkerchief in hand, which appeared filled with some new prize, and little Francis had a small fishing net formed like a bag and strung upon a stick which he carried on his shoulder. No sooner did they hear our voices than they flew to meet us, surprised at our quick return. Jack reached us before the rest, and his first act was to open the handkerchief he held and pour out a large number of lobsters at our feet. Their mother and little Francis produced each as many more, forming altogether a prodigious heap, and all alive, so that we were sure of excellent dinners for some days at least. Some of the animals tried to escape in different directions, and the boys, in following them, were kept in full chase, sometimes pleased and sometimes angry, sometimes laughing, sometimes scolding at the bootless trouble they were engaged in. For no sooner had they seized a deserter than 10 more had followed his example. "Have I not been very lucky, Papa?" said little Francis. "For you must know it is I who found them out. Look, there are more than 200 of them, and see how large they are, and what fine claws they have. I am sure they will be quite delicious." "Excellent indeed, my little fellow, and particularly if it was your industry that first discovered them." "Yes, Father, it was Francis who saw them first, but it was I who ran to tell Mamma, and it was I who fetched the net and put it to rights, and it was I who went up to my knees in water to catch them." "You make a charming story of it together, my boys, but as it is an interesting subject, you may tell me as many particulars as you please. It is indeed an event of some importance for our kitchen, and I have great pleasure in looking forward to partaking of a dish of your providing." "Well then, Papa, as soon as you were gone, Mamma sat down outside the tent and began to work, while Francis and I took a little walk towards the river to find a proper place for you to begin the bridge." "Bravo, Mr. Architect! Did you find a proper place for me to begin the bridge?" "Yes, Father, yes," Jack replied. "But listen, and you will know all. When we reached the river, we saw a large stone just at the edge, and little Francis, kneeling down and touching it, suddenly cried out, 'Jack, Jack, Fritz's jackal is covered all over with lobsters. Run as fast as you can.' I sprang to him in an instant and saw not only the jackal covered with them, but legions more coming in with the stream. I ran to tell Mamma, who quickly got the net you brought from the vessel. Partly with this net and partly with our hands, we caught those you see in a very few minutes, and we should have caught a much larger number if we had not heard you call, for the river is quite full of them." "You took quite enough for once, my boy," said I. "A little at a time is the maxim that suits us best, and I should even advise your taking the smallest of them back to the river, where they will grow larger. We shall still have sufficient for several magnificent repasts." "This then," said I to myself, "is a new source for our support. Even here in these arid regions, we find means to procure not only the necessaries of life, but even luxuries. May we never cease to evince our gratitude to Providence by the exercise of a more than ordinary care and industry." After giving in our turn an account of our voyage, my wife set about dressing one of the lobsters, and in the meantime, Fritz and I employed ourselves in untying the raft of timbers and planks, and in moving them from the boat. I then imitated the example of the Laplanders in harnessing their reindeer for drawing their sledges, instead of traces, halters, etc. I put a piece of rope with a running knot at the end, round the neck of the ass, and past the other end between its legs, to which I tied the piece of wood which I wished to be removed. The cow was harnessed in the same manner, and we were thus enabled to carry our materials piece by piece to the spot which architect Jack had chosen at the river as the most eligible for our bridge. To say the truth, I thought his judgment excellent. It was a place where the bank on each side was steep and of equal height. "Now then, boys," said I, "the first thing is to see if our timbers are long enough to reach the other side. By my eye, I should think they are, but if I had a surveyor's plane, we might be quite sure instead of working at a venture." "But my mother has some balls of pack thread with which she measured the height of a giant tree," interrupted Ernest. "And nothing would be more easy than to tie a stone to the end of one of them and throw it to the other side of the river. Then we could draw it to the very brink and thus obtain the exact length that would be required for our timbers." "Your idea is excellent," cried I. "Nothing gives me more pleasure than to see you exercise your invention. Run quickly and fetch the pack thread." He returned without loss of time. The stone was tied to its end and thrown across as we had planned. We drew it gently back to the river edge, marking the place where the bridge was to rest. We next measured the string and found that the distance from one side to the other was 18 feet. It appeared to me that to give a sufficient solidity to the timbers, I must allow 3 feet at each end of extra length for fixing them, making therefore in all 24, and I was fortunate enough to find that many of those we had brought did not fall short of this length. There now remained the difficulty of carrying one end across the stream, but we determined to discuss this part of the subject while we ate our dinner, which had been waiting for us more than an hour. We all proceeded homewards, and entering the kitchen, we found our good steward had prepared for us a large dish of lobsters. But before tasting them, she insisted we should look at something she had been employed about. She produced 2 sacks intended for the ass, which she had seamed with pack thread. The work, she assured us, had with difficulty been accomplished, since for want of a needle large enough to carry pack thread, she had been obliged to make a hole with a nail for every stitch. We might therefore judge by her perseverance in such a task of the ardour with which she longed to see her plan of removal executed. She received on this occasion, as well was her due, abundance of compliments and thanks from her companions, and also a little good-humoured raillery. For this time we hurried through our meal, each being deeply interested in the work we were about to undertake, and thinking only of the part which might be assigned him towards the execution of the nonsuch for this. For Mutual Encouragement was the name we gave our bridge, even before it was in existence. Having consulted as to the means of laying down our timbers across the river, the first thing I did was to attach one of them to the trunk of the tree of which I had already spoken by a strong cord, long enough to turn freely round the trunk. I then fastened a second cord to the other end of the timber, and tying a stone to its extremity, flung it to the opposite bank. I next passed the river as I had done before, furnished with a pulley which I secured to a tree. I passed my second cord through the pulley, and recrossing the river with this cord in my hand, I contrived to harness the ass and cow to the end of the cord. I next drove the animals from the bank of the river. They resisted at first, but I made them go by force of drawing. I first fixed one end of the beam firm to the trunk of the tree, and then they drew along the other end, so as gradually to advance over the river. Presently, to my great joy, I saw it touch the other side, and at length became fixed and firm by its own weight. In a moment Fritz and Jack leaped upon the timber, and in spite of my fears, crossed the stream with a joyful step upon this narrow but effective bridge. The first timber being thus laid, the difficulty was considerably diminished. A second and a third were fixed in succession, and with the greatest ease. Fritz and I, standing on opposite sides of the river, placed them at such distances from each other as was necessary to form a broad and handsome bridge. What now remained to be done was to lay some short planks across them quite close to each other, which we executed so expeditiously that our construction was completed in a much shorter time than I should have imagined possible. The reader should have seen our young workmen to form the least conception of the delight they felt. They jumped, danced, played 1,000 antics, and uttered 1,000 joyful sounds upon their bridge. For my own part, I could hardly restrain myself from joining in those demonstrations of their perfect happiness, and my wife, who had been the mover of all our operations, was as little disposed to a silent, calm enjoyment of our success as any of the rest. She ran to one and then to another, embracing each in turn, and was never tired of passing and repassing on our piece of workmanship, which was everywhere safe and even, and at least 10 feet in breadth. I had not fastened the cross planks to each other, for they appeared to be close and firm without it, and besides, I recollected that in case of danger from any kind of invasion, we could with the greater ease remove them, and thus render the passage of the river more difficult. Our labour, however, had occasioned us so much fatigue that we found ourselves unable for that day to enter upon new exertions. We returned to our home, where we partook heartily of an excellent supper and went to bed. Chapter 8. Change of Abode. As soon as we were up and had breakfast the next morning, I assembled all the members of my family together to take with them a solemn farewell of this our first refuge after the awful disaster of the shipwreck. I confess that for my own part, I could not leave it without regret. It was a place of greater safety than we were likely to gain to meet with. It was also nearer to the vessel. I thought it right to represent strongly to my sons the danger of exposing themselves, as they had done the evening before along the river. We are now going, continued I, to inhabit an unknown spot, which is not so well protected by nature as that we are leaving. We are unacquainted both with the soil and with its inhabitants, whether human creatures or beasts. Much caution is therefore necessary, and so take care not to remain separate from each other. Having unburdened my mind of this necessary charge, we prepared for setting out. I directed my sons to assemble our whole flock of animals and to leave the ass and the cow to me, that I might load them with the sacks as before agreed upon. I made a slit long ways in the middle of each, and at each of the slits I tied several long pieces of cord, which crossing each other and being again brought round and fastened, served to hold the sacks firmly on the back of the animal. We next began to put together all the things we should stand most in need of for the 2 or 3 first days in our new abode. Working implements, kitchen utensils, the captain's service of plate, and a small provision of butter. I put these articles into the 2 ends of each sack, taking care that the sides should be equally heavy, and then fasten them on. I afterwards added our hammocks, to complete the load, and we were about to begin to march when my wife stopped me. "We must not," said she, "leave our fowls behind, for fear they should become the prey of jackals. We must contrive a place for them among the luggage, and also one for our little Francis, who cannot walk so far and would interrupt our speed. There is also my enchanted bag, which I recommend to your particular care," said she, smiling, "for who can tell what may yet pop out of it for your good pleasure." I now placed the child on the ass's back, fixing the enchanted bag in such a way as to support him, and I tied them together with so many cords that the animal might even have galloped without danger of his falling off. In the meanwhile, the other boys had been running after the cocks and hens and the pigeons, but had not succeeded in catching one of them, so they returned empty-handed and in ill humour. "Little blockheads," said their mother, "see how you have heated yourselves in running after these untractable creatures. I could have put you in a way to catch them in a moment. Come with me and see." She now stepped into the tent and brought out 2 handfuls of peas and oats, and by pronouncing a few words of invitation in the accustomed tone, the birds flocked round her. She then walked slowly before them, dropping grain all the way, till they had followed her into the tent, when she saw them all inside and busily employed in picking up the grain. She shut the entrance and caught one after the other without difficulty. The boys looked at each other, half ashamed, though much amused with the adventure. The fowls were then tied by the feet and wings, put into a basket, covered with a net, and placed in triumph at the top of our luggage. We packed and placed in the tent everything we were to leave, and for greater security fastened down the ends of the sailcloth at the entrance by driving stakes through them into the ground. We ranged a number of vessels, both full and empty, round the tent to serve as a rampart, and thus we confided to the protection of heaven our remaining treasures. At length we set ourselves in motion. Each of us, great and small, carried a gun upon his shoulder and a game bag at his back. My wife led the way with her eldest son, the cow and the ass immediately behind them. The goat, conducted by Jack, came next. The little monkey was seated on the back of his nurse. After the goat came Ernest, conducting the sheep, while I, in my capacity of general superintendent, followed behind and brought up the rear. The dogs, for the most part, pranced backwards and forwards like a troop of soldiers. Our march was slow, and there was something patriarchal in the spectacle we exhibited. I fancied we must resemble our forefathers journeying in the deserts, accompanied by their families and their possessions. "Now then, Fritz," cried I, "you have the specimen you wished for of the patriarchal mode of life. What do you think of it?" "I like it much, father," replied he. "I never read the Bible without wishing I had lived in those good times." "And I too," said Ernest. "I am quite delighted with it. I cannot help fancying myself not merely a patriarch, but a Tartar or an Arab, and that we are about to discover I know not how many new and extraordinary things. Is it not true, father, that the Tartars and the Arabs pass their lives in journeying from one place to another and carrying all they have about with them?" "It is certainly for the most part true," replied I, "and they are called wandering tribes. But they generally perform their journeys attended by horses and camels, by means of which they can proceed a little faster than if, like us, they had only an ass and a cow. For my part, I should not be sorry if I were quite sure that the pilgrimage we are now making would be our last. And I too am of your way of thinking, cried my wife, and I hope that in our new abode we shall be so well satisfied with the shade of such luxuriant trees that we shall not be inclined to further rambles. We had now advanced halfway across our bridge, when the sow for the first time took the fancy of joining us. At the moment of our departure, she had shown herself so restive and untractable that we were compelled to leave her behind us. But seeing that we had all left the place, she had set out voluntarily to overtake us, taking care, however, to apprise us by her continued grunting that she disapproved of our migration. On the other side of the river, we experienced an inconvenience wholly unexpected. The tempting aspect of the grass, which grew here in profusion, drew off our animals who strayed from us to feed upon it, so that without the dogs we should not have been able to bring them back to the line of our possession. The active creatures were of great use to us on this occasion, and when everything was restored to proper order, we were able to continue our journey. For fear, however, of a similar occurrence, I directed our march to the left, along the seaside, where the produce of the soil was not of a quality to attract them. But scarcely had we advanced a few steps on the sands, when our two dogs, which had strayed behind among the grass, set up a sort of howl, as if engaged in an encounter with some formidable animal. Fritz in an instant raised his gun to his cheek and was ready to fire. Ernest, always somewhat timid, drew back to his mother's side. Jack ran bravely after Fritz with his gun upon his shoulder, while I, fearing the dogs might be attacked by some dangerous wild beast, prepared myself to advance to their assistance. But youth is always full of ardour, and in spite of my exhortations to proceed with caution, the boys, eager for the event, made but 3 jumps to the place from which the noise proceeded. In an instant, Jack had turned to meet me, clapping his hands and calling out, "Come quickly, father, come quickly. Here is a monstrous porcupine." I soon reached the spot and perceived that it was really as they said, bating a little exaggeration. The dogs were running to and fro, with bleeding noses about the animal, and when they approached too near him, he made a frightful noise and darted his quills so suddenly at them that a great number had penetrated the skins of the creatures and remained sticking in them, and it was no doubt the pain they occasioned which made them howl so violently. While we were looking on, Jack determined on an attack, which succeeded well. He took one of the pistols which he carried in his belt and aimed it so exactly at the head of the porcupine that it fell dead the instant he fired. And before we had a notion of what he was about, this success raised Jack to the height of joy and vanity, while Fritz, on the other hand, felt a sensation of jealousy almost to shedding tears. "Is it right, Jack," said he, "that such a little boy as you should venture to fire off a pistol in this manner? How easily you might have wounded my father or me, or one of the dogs, by so rash an action." "Oh yes, to be sure. And what do you suppose hindered me from seeing that you were all behind me? Do you think I fired without taking care of that? Do you take me for a fool? The porcupine could tell me about that, brother Fritz, if he could speak. My first fire, pop, dead as a herring. This is something, brother Fritz, and you would be glad enough to have had such a chance yourself." Fritz only replied by a motion of his head. He was out of humour because his younger brother had deprived him of the honour of the day, and he sought a subject of complaint against him, as the wolf did with the poor little lamb. "Come, come, boys," said I, "let me hear no envious speeches and no reproaches. Luck for one today, for another tomorrow, but all for the common good." Jack was perhaps a little imprudent, but you must allow that he showed both skill and courage. Let us not therefore tarnish the glory of his exploit. We now all got round the extraordinary animal on whom nature had bestowed a strong defence, by arming his body all over with long spears. The boys were at a loss what means to use for carrying away his carcass. They thought of dragging it along the ground, but as often as they attempted to take hold, there was nothing but squalling and running to show the marks made by his quills on their hands. "We must leave him behind," said they, "but it is a great pity." While the boys were talking, my wife and I hastened to relieve the dogs by drawing out the quills and examining their wounds. Fritz had run on before with his gun, hoping he should meet with some animal of prey. What he most desired was to find one or two of those large bustards which his mother had described to him. We followed him at our leisure, taking care not to expose our health by unnecessary fatigue, till at last, without further accident or adventure, we arrived at the place of the giant trees. Such indeed we found them, and our astonishment exceeded all description. Good heavens, what trees, what a height, what trunks! I never heard of any so prodigious, exclaimed one and all. "Nothing can be more rational than your admiration," answered I, measuring them with my eyes as I spoke. I must confess, I had not myself formed an idea of the reality. To you be all the honour, my dear wife, for the discovery of this agreeable abode, in which we shall enjoy so many comforts and advantages. The great point we have to gain is the fixing a tent large enough to receive us all in one of these trees, by which means we shall be perfectly secure from the invasion of wild beasts. I defy even one of the bears who are so famous for mounting trees to climb up by a trunk so immense and so destitute of branches. We began now to release our animals from their burdens, having first thrown our own on the grass. We next used the precaution of tying their two forelegs together with a cord, that they might not go far away or lose themselves. We restored the fowls to liberty, and then seating ourselves upon the grass, we held a family council on the subject of our future establishment. I was myself somewhat uneasy on the question of our safety during the ensuing night, for I was ignorant of the nature of the extensive country I beheld around me, and what chance there might be of our being attacked by different kinds of wild beasts. I accordingly observed to my wife that I would make an endeavour for us all to sleep in the tree that very night. While I was deliberating with her on the subject, Fritz, who longed to take his revenge for the porcupine adventure, had stolen away at a short distance, and we heard the report of a gun. This would have alarmed me, if at the same moment we had not recognised Fritz's voice crying out, "I touched him, I touched him," and in a moment we saw him running towards us, holding a dead animal of uncommon beauty by the paws. "Father, father, look, here is a superb tiger cat," said he, proudly raising it in the air to show it to the best advantage. "Bravo, bravo," cried I. "Nimrod the Undaunted, your exploit will call forth the gratitude of our cocks, hens, and pigeons, for you have rendered them what they cannot fail to think an important service. If you had not killed this animal, he would no doubt have demolished in one night our whole stock of poultry. I charge you look about in every direction, and try to destroy as many of the species as fall in your way, for we cannot have more dangerous intruders." In the meanwhile, my wife had been busy in making a fire, putting on the pot, and preparing for our dinner. The tiger cat was bestowed upon the dogs, who waited impatiently to receive it. While our dinner was dressing, I employed my time in making some packing needles with some of the quills of the porcupine, which the boys had contrived to draw from his skin and bring home. I put the point of a large nail into the fire till it was red hot. Then, taking hold of it with some wet linen in my hand, by way of guide, I, with great ease, perforated the thick end of the quills with it. I had soon the pleasure of presenting my wife with a large packet of long stout needles, which were the more valuable in her estimation, as she had formed the intention of contriving some better harness for our animals, and had been perplexed how to set about it without some larger needles. I, however, recommended to her to be frugal in the use of her pack thread, for which I should soon have so urgent a need in constructing a ladder for ascending the tree we intended to inhabit. I had singled out the highest fig tree, and while we were waiting for dinner, I made the boys try how high they could throw a stick or stone into it. I also tried, but the lowest branches were so far from the ground that none of us could touch them. I perceived, therefore, that we should want some new inventions for fastening the ends of my ladder to them. I allowed a short pause in my imagination, during which I assisted Jack and Fritz in carrying the skin of the tiger cat to a near rivulet, where we placed it under water with some large stones above it. After this we returned, and dined heartily on some slices of ham and bread and cheese under the shade of our favourite trees. Chapter 9. Construction of a Ladder. Our repast ended, I observed to my wife that we should be obliged to pass the night on the ground. I desired her to begin preparing the harness for the animals, that they might go to the seashore and fetch pieces of wood or other articles which might be useful to us. In the meantime, I set about suspending our hammocks to some of the arched roots of the trees. I next spread a piece of sailcloth, large enough to cover them, to preserve us from the dew and from the insects. I then hastened with the 2 eldest boys to the seashore to choose out such pieces of wood as were most proper for the steps of my ladder. Ernest was so lucky as to discover some bamboo canes in a sort of bog. I took them out, and with his assistance completely cleared them from the mud, and stripping off their leaves, I found, to my great joy, that they were precisely what I wanted. I then instantly began to cut them with my hatchet in pieces of 4 or 5 feet long. The boys bound them together in bunches, and we prepared to return with them to our place of abode. I next secured some of the straight and most slender of the stalks to make some arrows, of which I knew I should stand in need. At some distance from the place where we stood, I perceived a sort of thicket, in which I hoped to find some young pliant twigs, which I thought might also be useful to me. We proceeded to the spot, but fearing it might be the retreat of some dangerous reptile or animal, we held our guns in readiness. Flora, who had accompanied us, went before. We had hardly reached the thicket before she made several jumps and threw herself furiously into the middle of the bushes. Then a troop of large-sized flamingos sprang out, and with a loud rustling noise mounted into the air. Fritz fired, and 2 of the birds fell among the bushes, one of them quite dead. The other was only slightly wounded in the wing, and finding that he could not fly, he ran so fast towards the water that we were afraid he would escape us. Fritz, in the joy of his heart, plunged up to his knees in the water to pick up the flamingo he had killed, and with great difficulty was able to get out again, while I, warned by his example, proceeded more cautiously in my pursuit of the wounded bird. Flora came to my assistance, and running on before, caught hold of the flamingo and held him fast till I reached the spot and took him into my protection. All this was effected with considerable trouble, for the bird made a stout resistance, flapping its wings with violence for some time, but at last I succeeded in securing him. Fritz was not long in extricating himself from the swamp. He now appeared holding the dead flamingo by the feet, but I had more trouble in the care of mine, as I had a great desire to preserve him alive. I had tied his feet and his wings with my handkerchief, notwithstanding which he continued to flutter about to a distressing degree, and tried to make his escape. I held the flamingo under my left arm and my gun in my right hand. I made the best jumps I was able to get to the boys, but at the risk of sinking every moment in the mud, which was extremely deep and from which it would have been difficult to release me. The joy of the boys was great when they saw that my flamingo was alive. If we can but cure his wound and contrive to feed him, what a happiness it will be, said they. Do you think he will like to be with the other fowls? I know, answered I, that he is a bird that may be easily tamed, but he will not thank you for such food as we give our fowls. He will make his humble petition to you for some small fish, a few worms or insects. But one of you must hold our live flamingo, while I repeat my visit to the canes, for I have not done with them yet. I accordingly selected some of the older of the stalks, and cut from them their hard-pointed ends, to serve for the tips of my arrows, for which they are also used by the savages of the Antilles. Lastly, I looked for 2 of the longest canes, which I cut for the purpose of measuring the height of our giant tree, about which I felt so deep an interest. When I told my sons the use I intended to make of the 2 longest canes, they indulged themselves in a hearty laugh at me, and maintained that though I should lay 10 such canes up the trunk of the tree, the last would not reach even the lowest branch. I requested that they would oblige me by having a little patience, and I reminded them that it was not long ago that they defied their mother to catch the fowls, because they themselves had not known how to set about it. We now thought of returning. Ernest took charge of the canes. Fritz carried the dead flamingo, and I resumed the care of the living one. We had reached the spot where we had left 3 bundles of bamboo canes, and as my sons were sufficiently loaded, I took charge of them myself. We at length arrived once more at our giant trees, and were received with 1,000 expressions of interest and kindness. All were delighted at the sight of our new captures. My wife, with her usual anxiety about the means of subsisting, asked where we should get food enough for all the animals we brought home. "You should consider," said I, "that some of them feed us instead of being fed, and the one we have now brought you need not give much uneasiness, if, as I hope, he proves able to find food for himself." I now began to examine his wound, and found that only one wing was injured by the ball, but the other had also been slightly wounded by the dog's laying hold of him. I applied some ointment to both, which seemed immediately to ease the pain. I next tied him by one of his legs with a long string to a stake I had driven into the ground quite near to the river, that he might go in and wash himself when he pleased. In the meantime, my little railers had tied the two longest canes together and were endeavouring to measure the tree with them. But when they found that they reached no farther than the top of the arch formed by the roots, they all burst into fits of laughter, assuring me that if I wished to measure the tree, I must think of some other means. I, however, sobered them a little by recalling to Fritz's memory some lessons in land surveying he had received in Europe, and that the measure of the highest mountains and their distance from each other may be ascertained by the application of triangles and supposed lines. I instantly proceeded to this kind of operation, fixing my canes in the ground and making use of some string, which Fritz guided according to my directions. I found that the height of the lower branches of our tree was 40 feet, a particular I was obliged to ascertain before I could determine the length of my ladder. I now set Fritz and Ernest to work to measure our stock of thick rope, of which I wanted no less than 80 feet for the two sides of the ladder. The two youngest I employed in collecting all the small string we had used for measuring and carrying it to their mother. For my own part, I sat down on the grass and began to make some arrows with a piece of the bamboo and the short, sharp points of the canes I had taken such pains to secure. As the arrows were hollow, I filled them with the moist sand to give them a little weight, and lastly I tipped them with a bit of feather from the flamingo to make them fly straight. Scarcely had I finished my work when the boys came jumping around me, uttering 1,000 demonstrations of joy. "A bow, a bow, and some real arrows," cried they, addressing each other and then running to me. "Tell us, father," continued they, "what you are going to do with them. Do let me shoot one, and me too," cried one and all as fast as they could speak. "Have patience, boys, I say, have patience. Have you, my dear, any strong thread?" said I to my wife. "We shall see," she said, "what my enchanted bag, which has never yet refused its aid, can do for you." She then threw open its mouth. "Come," said she, "pretty bag, give me what I ask for. My husband wants some thread, and it must be very strong. See now, did I not promise you should have your wish? Here is a large ball of the very thread you want." "But I do not see much magic," said Ernest. "However, mother, in taking out of a bag exactly what we had before put into it." Father replied, "If we are to discuss the matter seriously, Ernest, I cannot but allow that your observation is a just one. But in a moment of dreadful apprehension, such as we experienced on leaving the vessel, to think of a variety of little things that might be useful to one or all of us, was an act that we may truly call magical. Only from the best of wives and mothers could it have proceeded. It is then something like a truth, that your mother is a good fairy who constantly provides for all our wants. But you, young giddy things, think little of the benefit you thus enjoy. Just at this moment, Fritz joined us, having finished measuring the string. He brought to me the welcome tidings that our stock in all was about 500 fathoms, which I knew to be more than sufficient for my ladder. I now tied the end of the ball of strong thread to an arrow, and fixing it to the bow, I shot it off in such a direction as to make the arrow pass over one of the largest branches of the tree and fall again to the ground. By this method, I lodged my thread securely while I had the command of the end and the ball below. It was now easy to tie a piece of rope to the end of the thread and draw it upwards till the knot should reach the same branch. Having thus made quite sure of being able to raise my ladder, we all set to work with increased zeal and confidence. The first thing I did was to cut a length of about 100 feet from my parcel of ropes, an inch thick. This I divided into 2 equal parts, which I stretched along the ground in 2 parallel lines at a distance of a foot from each other. I then directed Fritz to cut portions of sugar cane, each 2 feet in length. Ernest handed them to me, one after another, and as I received them, I inserted them into my cords at the distance of 12 inches respectively, fixing them with knots in the cord, while Jack, by my order, drove into each a long nail at the 2 extremities, to hinder them from slipping out again. Thus, in a very short time, I had formed a ladder of 40 rounds in length, and in point of execution firm and compact, in which we all beheld with a sort of joyful astonishment. I now tied it with strong knots to the end of the rope which hung from the tree, and pulled it by the other till our ladder reached the branch and seemed to rest so well upon it that the joyous exclamations of the boys and my wife resounded from all sides. All the boys wished to be the first to ascend upon it, but I decided that it should be Jack, he being the nimblest and of the lightest figure among them. Accordingly, his brothers and I held the ends of the rope and of the ladder with all our strength, while our young adventurer tripped up the rounds with perfect ease, and presently took his post upon the branch. But I observed that he had not strength enough to tie the rope firmly to the tree. Fritz now interfered, assuring me that he could ascend as safely as his brother. But as he was much heavier, I was not altogether without apprehension. I fastened the end of the ladder with forked stakes to the ground, and then gave him instructions how to step in such a way as to divide his weight, by occupying 4 rounds of the ladder at the same time with his feet and hands. It was not long before we saw him side by side with Jack, 40 feet above our heads, and both saluting us with cries of exultation. Fritz set to work to fasten the ladder by passing the rope round and round the branch, and this he performed with so much skill and intelligence that I felt sufficient reliance to determine me to ascend myself and conclude the business he had begun. But first I tied a large pulley to the end of the rope and carried it with me. When I was at the top, I fastened the pulley to a branch which was within my reach, that by this means I might be able the next day to draw up the planks and timbers I might want for building my aerial castle. I executed all this by the light of the moon, and felt the satisfaction of having done a good day's work. I now gently descended my rope ladder and joined my wife and children. Finding an inconvenience in being 3 together on the branch, I had directed the boys to descend first. My astonishment, therefore, on reaching the ground, where neither Fritz nor Jack had made their appearance, it is easier to conceive than to describe. While I was endeavouring to conjecture where they could be, we suddenly heard the sounds of voices which seemed to come from the clouds, and which chanted an evening hymn. I soon perceived the trick played by our young rogues, who, seeing me busily employed in the tree, instead of descending as I had desired, had climbed upwards from branch to branch till they had reached the very top. My heart was now lightened of my apprehensions for their safety. I called out to them as loudly as I could to take great care in coming down. It was almost night, and the light of the moon scarcely penetrated the extreme thickness of the foliage. They presently descended without any accident, when they told us that my voice scarcely reached to the great height at which they were. I now directed them to assemble all our animals, and to get what dry wood we should want for making fires, which I looked to as our defence against the attack of wild beasts. I explained to them my reasons for this, informing them that in Africa, a country remarkable for its prodigious numbers of ferocious animals, the natives secure themselves from their nocturnal visits by lighting large fires, which all these creatures are known to dread and avoid. My wife now presented me with the day's work she had performed. It was some traces, and a breast leather each for the cow and the ass. I promised her as a reward for her zeal and exertion that we should all be completely settled in the tree the following day, and we then assembled to supper. All our animals came round us, one after the other. My wife threw some grain to the fowls to accustom them to draw together in a particular spot, and when they had eaten it, we had the pleasure of seeing our pigeons take their flight to the top of the giant tree, and the cocks and hens perching and settling themselves and cackling all the time upon the rounds of the ladder. The quadrupeds we tied to the arched roots of the tree, quite near to our hammocks, where they quietly lay in the grass to ruminate in tranquillity. Our beautiful flamingo was not forgotten, Fritz having fed him with some crumbs of biscuit soaked in milk, which he ate very heartily. And now the gaping of one and the outstretched arms of another gave us notice that it was time for our young labourers to retire to rest. We performed our evening devotions. I set fire to several of the heaps, and then threw myself contentedly upon my hammock. My young ones were already cased in theirs, and we were soon greeted with their murmurs at being obliged to lie so close to each other that they could not move their limbs. "Ah, gentlemen," cried I, "you must try to be contented. No sailor is ever better accommodated than you are now, and you must not expect beds to drop from the clouds on your behalf." I directed them how to put themselves in a more convenient posture, and to swing their hammock gently to and fro. "And see," added I, "if sleep will not visit you in a hammock as on a bed of down. They profited by my advice, and all except myself was soon asleep. Chapter 10. The Settling in the Giant Tree. I had thought it necessary to keep watch during this first night. Every leaf that stirred gave me the apprehension that it was the approach of a jackal or a tiger who might attack us. As soon as one of the heaps was consumed, I lighted another, and at length, finding that no animal appeared, I by degrees became assured and fell into a sound sleep. The next morning we took our breakfast and fell to work. My wife, having finished her daily occupation of milking the cow and preparing the breakfast, set off with Ernest, Jack and Francis, attended by the ass, to the seashore. They had no doubt of finding some more pieces of wood, and they thought it would be prudent to replenish our exhausted store. In her absence, I ascended the tree with Fritz, and made the necessary preparations for my undertaking, for which I found it in every respect convenient, for the branches grew close to each other, and in an exactly horizontal direction, such as grew in a manner to obstruct my design. I cut off with either the saw or hatchet, leaving none but what presented me with a sort of foundation for my work. I left those which spread themselves evenly upon the trunk, and had the largest circuit as a support for my floor. Above these, at the height of 46 feet, I found others upon which to suspend our hammocks, and higher still, there was a further series of branches destined to receive the roof of my tent, which for the present was to be formed of nothing more than a large surface of sailcloth. The progress of these preparations was considerably slow. It was necessary to raise certain beams to this height of 40 feet that were too heavy for my wife and her little assistants to lift from the ground. I had, however, the resource of my pulley, which served to excellent purpose, and Fritz and I contrived to draw them up to the elevation of the tent, one by one. While I had already placed 2 beams upon the branches, I hastened to fix my planks upon them, and I made my floor double, that it might have sufficient solidity if the beams should be warped from their places. I then formed a wall of staves of wood, like a park paling, all round for safety. This operation and a third journey to the seashore to collect the timber necessary filled our morning so completely that not one of us had thought about dinner. For this once we contented ourselves with a bit of ham and some milk, which we ate and returned to finish our aerial palace, which began to make an imposing appearance. We unhooked our hammocks from the projecting roots, and by means of my pulley contrived to hoist them up the tree. The sailcloth roof was supported by the thick branches above, and as it was of great compass and hung down on every side, the idea occurred to me of nailing it to the paling on 2 sides, thus getting not only a roof but 2 walls also, the immense trunk of the tree forming a 3rd side, while in the 4th was the entrance to our apartment, and in this I left a large aperture, both as a means of seeing what passed without, a current of air to cool us in this burning temperature. We also on this side enjoyed an extensive view of the vast ocean and its lengthening shore. The hammocks were soon hung on the branches, and everything was ready for our reception that very evening. Well satisfied with the execution of my plan, I descended with Fritz, who had assisted me throughout the whole. And as the day was not far advanced, and I observed we had still some planks remaining, we set about contriving a large table to be placed between the roots of the tree and surrounded with benches. And this place, we said, should be called our dining room. But this time we performed our task imperfectly, for I confess I was much fatigued. The table, however, was such as might be well endured, and my wife expressed her approbation as she looked on, busied with preparations for our supper. In the meantime, the 3 youngest boys collected all the pieces of wood we had thrown down from the tree, and a quantity of small wood to dry in a heap at a small distance from our fireplace. Exhausted by the fatigues of the day, I threw myself on a bank, and my wife having seated herself near me, I thanked her for the tender care she was ever imposing on herself, and then I observed to her that the many blessings we enjoyed led the thoughts naturally to the beneficent giver of them all, and tomorrow being a Sabbath day, we would rest from work in obedience to his command, and otherwise keep it holy. We now assembled round our table to supper, my wife holding on her hand an earthen pot, which we had before observed upon the fire, and the contents of which we were all curious to be informed of. She took off the cover, and with a fork drew out of it the flamingo which Fritz had killed. She informed us that she had preferred dressing it this way to roasting, because Ernest had assured her that it was an old bird, which would prove hard and tough, and had advised her to improve it by stewing. We rallied our glutton boy on this foible of his character, and his brothers gave him the name of the cook. We, however, had soon reason to know that he had conferred upon us an important obligation, for the bird which roasted we perhaps should not have been able to touch, now appeared excellent, and was eaten up to the very bones. While we were enjoying our repast, the live flamingo stalked up to the place where we were sitting in the midst of our flock of fowls to receive his part of the repast. He had now become so tame that we had released him from the stake. He took his walks gravely from place to place and looked perfectly contented with his company. His fine plumage was a most pleasing sight, while on the other hand the sportive tricks and the grimaces of our little monkey afforded the most agreeable spectacle imaginable. The little animal had become quite familiar with us, jumped from the shoulder of one to that of another, always caught the meat we threw him, and ate in so pleasant a way as to make us laugh heartily. The boys now, by my direction, lighted one of the heaps of wood. We tied long ropes loosely round the necks of our dogs, purposing to mount to our tent with the ends in my hand, that I might be able to let them loose upon the enemy at the first barking I should hear. Everyone was eager to retire to rest, and the signal for ascending the ladder was given. The 3 eldest boys were up in an instant. Then came their mother's turn, who proceeded slowly and cautiously, and arrived in perfect safety. My own ascension was last and most difficult, for I carried little Francis on my back, and the end of the ladder had been loosened at the bottom, that I might be able to draw it up in the tent during the night. Every step, therefore, was made with the greatest difficulty in consequence of its swinging motion. At last, however, I got to the top, and to the admiration of the boys, drew the ladder after me. It appeared to them that we were in one of the strong castles of the ancient cavaliers, in which when the drawbridge is raised, the inhabitants are secured from every attack of the enemy. Notwithstanding this apparent safety, I kept our guns in readiness for whatever event might require their use. We now abandoned ourselves to repose. Our hearts experienced a full tranquillity, and the fatigue we had all undergone induced so sound a sleep that daylight shone full in the front of our habitation before our eyes had opened.